Picture this, a city of 400,000 people plunged into absolute darkness, not for an hour, not for a day, but indefinitely. Santiago de Cuba, February 5th, 2026. The lights didn't flicker, they died. And this time, they're not coming back. Because Cuba just crossed a threshold no modern nation should ever reach, a point of no return that's been decades in the making. While the world was distracted by wars and elections, an island nation 90 miles from the United States was silently suffocating. Their oil reserves? Gone, completely depleted. Their power grid? A corpse held together by duct tape and Soviet-era prayers. Their people? Trapped in what historians will call the first true energy death spiral of the 21st century. This isn't just another blackout story. This is about what happens when an entire economic system built on borrowed oil and political favors finally runs dry. And the clock started ticking years ago. We just weren't paying attention. Because what happened on February 5th wasn't an accident. It was inevitable. Let me show you how a nation dies in slow motion. Cuba's collapse didn't start with empty oil tanks. It started with full ones from someone else. For decades, Cuba survived on a lifeline, Venezuelan oil, cheap, abundant, and, most importantly, politically motivated. Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro sent over 100,000 barrels per day to their communist allies, not because it made economic sense, but because Cuba was Venezuela's ideological twin. That arrangement kept the lights on in Havana. It kept the economy limping forward. It kept the regime alive. But here's the thing about lifelines. They only work when the other person can breathe too. And Venezuela? They've been drowning for years. By 2024, those oil shipments dropped to barely 30,000 barrels per day. By late 2025, they were almost non-existent. Cuba's government tried to hide it. They rationed electricity, they blamed maintenance issues, they pointed fingers at the U.S. embargo. But the truth was undeniable. The oil was running out, and they had no backup plan. No reserves, no alternatives, no infrastructure to pivot to renewables or nuclear or anything else. Just a ticking clock and 11 million people waiting in the dark. So when February 5th arrived and Santiago went black, it wasn't a surprise to analysts. It was the sound of inevitability catching up. But this is where it gets terrifying. Because Santiago wasn't supposed to be first. Havana was. The capital, home to 2 million people, the political heart of the regime, the city that gets priority for everything, should have collapsed first. But it didn't. And that tells you everything you need to know about the choices Cuba's government made in those final months. They sacrificed the provinces to buy time for the center. Santiago, Holguin, Camagüey, cities with hundreds of thousands of people were systematically starved of power so Havana could keep functioning. Rolling blackouts became permanent blackouts. Hospitals ran on generators until the diesel ran out. Water pumps stopped. Sewage treatment plants went offline. And the government kept saying the same thing. It's temporary. We're fixing it. Just wait. But the people in Santiago weren't stupid. They knew what was happening. They could feel it in their bones. The heat became unbearable without fans. Food spoiled within hours. The elderly started dying, not dramatically, not in headline-grabbing numbers, but quietly, one by one, in homes that had become ovens. And then came the protests. Small at first, a few dozen people banging pots in the streets, chanting for power, for answers, for hope. The regime responded the only way it knows: force. Arrests, intimidation, threats. But here's where dictatorships make their fatal miscalculation. You can suppress anger, you can jail dissidents, you can control the narrative when people have something to lose. But when you strip away everything, when there's no power, no food security, no future, fear stops working, and desperation becomes the most dangerous force on earth. By mid-February, the protests in Santiago weren't small anymore. They were spreading. Holguin joined in, then Camagüey, then Las Tunas. Thousands of people flooding the streets, not with political slogans, but with a single primal demand: turn the lights back on. But the government couldn't, because the problem wasn't political anymore. It was mathematical. Cuba's national oil reserves, the emergency stockpile meant to last months, hit zero in late January 2026. Not critically low, not dangerously depleted, zero. And without oil, the entire equation collapses. No fuel for generators, no diesel for trucks, no gasoline for the few functioning vehicles, no power for hospitals, no refrigeration for medicine, no pumps for clean water. The country wasn't just losing electricity, it was losing civilization. And the world still barely paying attention. A few news articles buried on page 6, some tweets from energy analysts, a handful of think tank reports that nobody read. Because Cuba had been in crisis for so long that actual collapse felt like just another Tuesday. But this time was different. This time there was no cavalry coming. Venezuela couldn't help. They were busy with their own implosion. Russia was stretched thin in Ukraine and couldn't afford to prop up distant allies. China? They'd grown cold on Cuba years ago, realizing the island had nothing left to offer. And the United States? Well, let's just say watching the Cuban regime finally crumble after 65 years wasn't exactly a tragedy in Washington. So Cuba stood alone. No oil, no allies, no options. Just 11 million people staring into the abyss. And then something happened that nobody predicted. The exodus began. Not with announcements, not with organized evacuations, but with makeshift rafts hitting the water under cover of darkness. Cubans call them balsas, crude vessels made from inner tubes, plywood, rope, whatever floats. They've been used for decades by those desperate enough to risk the 90-mile journey to Florida. But this time was different. This wasn't a trickle of dissidents fleeing political persecution. This was a flood of families fleeing systemic collapse. Entire neighborhoods in coastal towns were emptying. People weren't debating anymore. They weren't weighing options or considering consequences. They were looking at their children in the sweltering dark and making a calculation. What's more dangerous, the ocean or staying here? And increasingly, the answer was staying here. The U.S. Coast Guard was overwhelmed within days. Dozens of rafts intercepted daily, then hundreds. Survivors told the same story over and over. No power for 3 weeks, no food in stores, no medicine in hospitals. We had no choice, they said. Cuba is finished. And they were right. Because while the protests raged and the rafts launched, something even more sinister was unfolding inland. The food system was collapsing. Cuba imports roughly 70% of its food, a vulnerability that seems insane until you understand the history. For decades, the Soviet Union subsidized everything. Then Venezuela picked up the slack. But now, with no oil to power trucks, no diesel for tractors, no fuel for fishing boats, the entire supply chain imploded. Stores in Havana, the privileged capital, were running bare. Outside the capital, shelves had been empty for weeks. People were surviving on rice and beans when they could get them. Then just rice. Then nothing. Malnutrition started showing up in hospitals, except the hospitals had no power to treat anyone anyway. The government tried to spin it. The U.S. embargo is starving us, they claimed, trotting out the same excuse they'd used for 60 years. But this time, even loyal party members weren't buying it. Because everyone knew the truth. The embargo didn't drain the oil reserves. Venezuela did that by collapsing. The embargo didn't shut down the power grid. Decades of neglect and zero infrastructure investment did that. The embargo didn't force the regime to prioritize ideology over pragmatism for half a century. That was a choice. And now the bill had come due. But here's what makes this truly terrifying, and what the international community still doesn't fully grasp. Cuba isn't just experiencing an energy crisis, it's experiencing state failure in real time. The military starting to fracture, reports of units refusing orders, officers quietly moving their families out of the country. The police stretched so thin they'd become irrelevant. You can't enforce order when you're also starving in the dark. The bureaucracy abandoned. Government workers stopped showing up when there was no transportation and no reason to pretend anymore. And the leadership? Holed up in Havana, clinging to the fantasy that somehow, some way, a savior would emerge. But no savior was coming. Instead, something else was emerging from the chaos. Something nobody anticipated. Because when a centralized authoritarian state collapses, it doesn't just leave a vacuum, it leaves tribes. By late February, Cuba wasn't one country anymore. It was fragmenting into dozens of micro-regions, each controlled by whoever had resources. Former military officers hoarding diesel. Local officials trading generator access for loyalty. Criminal networks, long suppressed by the regime, suddenly filling the power void. Communities forming armed watches to protect food supplies. This wasn't Mad Max chaos. It was something more subtle and more permanent. The slow, grinding dissolution of the nation-state itself. And the world was still treating it like a humanitarian crisis that could be solved with aid shipments. They didn't understand. You can't ship aid to a country that no longer functions as a country. You can't negotiate with a government that controls nothing beyond a few city blocks in Havana. You can't stabilize a situation that's already past the point of stabilization. Cuba had crossed the event horizon, and what happens next is going to reshape the entire Caribbean. Because here's what nobody's talking about yet. Cuba's collapse doesn't stay in Cuba. It metastasizes. The refugee crisis hitting Florida in February 2026, that's just the opening wave. The Coast Guard is intercepting 500+ people per day now, and those are just the ones they catch. How many rafts sink in the Florida Straits? How many people drown in the dark where nobody's watching? Nobody knows. But the ones who make it? They're not stopping in Miami. They're dispersing across the United States, carrying stories that haven't fully reached the mainstream yet. Stories of neighborhoods organizing militias to protect wells, of doctors performing surgery by candlelight, of elderly people dying alone because there's no way to call for help, of a government that stopped governing and just disappeared. And those stories are about to create a political firestorm in Washington. Because suddenly, the decades-old debate about Cuba embargo isn't theoretical anymore. Hawks are saying, see, the regime finally collapsed. We won. Now we secure the island before China moves in. Doves are saying, we have a humanitarian obligation. We caused this with sanctions. We need to intervene. Elationists are saying, not our problem. Seal the border and let them figure it out. But all of them are missing the real danger. Because Cuba isn't just collapsing, it's becoming a black hole. A failed state 90 miles from the U.S. mainland with no functioning government, no security apparatus, and no economy. The perfect breeding ground for everything Washington fears. Organized crime, human trafficking, drug corridors, jihadist recruitment in forgotten zones, and possibly, this is what keeps Pentagon analysts awake at night, a foothold for hostile powers. China's been quietly watching this unfold. They pulled back their investments years ago when Cuba proved to be an economic dead end. But a destabilized Cuba, a fragmented Cuba with no allegiance to anyone, that's valuable real estate. Imagine Beijing offering aid, security, infrastructure to whichever faction can hold Santiago's port. Or Russia, wounded, desperate, looking for any way to stick a thumb in America's eye, suddenly shipping humanitarian supplies with strings attached. The Cold War ended, but the game never did. And Cuba just became the board again. Meanwhile, the Caribbean is watching in horror. Because if Cuba, with its educated population, its revolutionary legacy, its decades of international support, can collapse this completely, what does that mean for Haiti, for Jamaica, for any small island nation living on the edge? The message is clear and chilling. Oil dependency is a death sentence. Climate vulnerability is a death sentence. Economic isolation is a death sentence. And the international system will watch you die in real time without lifting a finger. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. Because while governments debate and analysts theorize and refugees flee, the Cuban people themselves are writing a different story. In the darkness of Santiago, in the chaos of Camagüey, in the abandoned streets of Holguín, something's emerging. Not a revolution. Those require hope and organization and a vision of the future. This is something raw. Communities forming councils, neighbors sharing generators, fishermen organizing cooperative catches, doctors creating underground networks to share medicine, engineers jerry-rigging solar panels from scavenged parts, teachers holding classes in parks because the schools are ovens. It's not pretty. It's not utopian. People are still starving. People are still dying. But in the spaces where the state vanished, Cubans are doing what humans have always done: adapting, surviving, building from the rubble of something old. And here's what makes this so tragically ironic. The Cuban government spent 65 years telling its people that they couldn't survive without the state, that socialism was the only path, that individual initiative was counter-revolutionary, that the party knew best. And now, with the state gone, with the party collapsed, with socialism reduced to a cruel joke told in the dark, the Cuban people are proving they never needed it in the first place. They needed what was stolen from them: freedom, opportunity, the chance to build something of their own. And now, in the worst possible circumstances, they're getting that chance. Not because anyone gave it to them, but because there's nobody left to take it away. So what happens next? Does Cuba fracture permanently into tribal regions? Does the U.S. intervene and attempt nation-building 2.0? Does some new strongman emerge from the chaos and restore order at gunpoint? Does the international community finally coordinate a real recovery plan? Or does Cuba become something entirely new? A post-state experiment born from total collapse? Nobody knows. But one thing's certain: the Cuba that existed on February 5th, 2026 is never coming back. That country is dead. And what rises from its ashes will reshape our understanding of what happens when modern nations fail. Because this isn't some distant humanitarian crisis in Africa or the Middle East that Western audiences can ignore. This is 90 miles from Florida. This is a country millions of Americans have family ties to. This is a crisis that's already washing up on U.S. shores in the form of desperate people on rafts. And it's forcing the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. We're entering an era where nations don't just struggle, they disappear. Cuba won't be the last. Climate change is accelerating. Oil dependencies are tightening. Authoritarian regimes are brittling under pressure they can't adapt to. And the international system we built after World War II, it has no mechanism for handling total state collapse that doesn't involve military intervention. So, we're improvising in real time, making it up as we go. And the Cuban people? They're the guinea pigs. By March 2026, the situation has evolved into something almost unrecognizable. Havana still has power, barely, for a few hours a day, rationed through a lottery system that's breeding corruption and black markets. The government claims it's still in control, but everyone knows the truth. Miguel Díaz-Canel, Cuba's president, hasn't been seen in public for 3 weeks. Rumors swirl. He fled to Venezuela. He's negotiating asylum in Russia. He's dead. Nobody knows. Nobody's in charge. The state is a ghost. Meanwhile, Santiago has become something entirely else. A council of former military officers, local business owners, and community leaders have taken over basic administration. They're negotiating directly with Dominican Republic for diesel shipments. They're coordinating with Miami-based Cuban exile groups for solar panel donations. They're bypassing Havana completely because Havana has nothing to offer. And that's the model spreading across the island. Localized governance, direct international partnerships, pragmatic survival. Everything the regime spent decades preventing. It's messy, it's chaotic, corruption is rampant, violence flares over resources. But it's also working. Not well, not fairly, not humanely by any developed world standard. But people are eating. Some lights are coming back on. Water is flowing again in some neighborhoods. And the United States is faced with an impossible choice. Do nothing and watch a failed state fester 90 miles away, inevitably creating bigger problems down the line. Or intervene and own the aftermath of trying to rebuild a country that has been hostile to America for 65 years. Both options are terrible. So Washington does what it does best. Half measures. Humanitarian aid through NGOs, Coast Guard patrols increased, quiet diplomatic channels with the emerging regional councils, but no boots on the ground, no regime change operation, no grand Marshall Plan for Cuba. Just watching, waiting, managing the crisis at the margins. And honestly, that might be the smartest play, because the lesson of Cuba's collapse isn't that intervention is necessary. It's that some systems need to die before something better can be born. The Cuban regime was a zombie long before February 2020.
It was kept alive by Venezuelan oil, by the U.S. embargo giving it a scapegoat, by the romance of revolutionary nostalgia. But it was dead inside, corrupt, ossified, unable to adapt or reform or provide for its people. And now, with the zombie finally put down, space is opening for something new. We don't know what yet. Maybe a federation of regional governments. Maybe reunification under a new democratic system. Maybe permanent fragmentation. Maybe Cuban exiles returning en masse to rebuild, bringing capital and expertise. Maybe a lost generation and decades of suffering before stability returns. All of those futures are possible. But here's what's certain. Cuba's collapse is a preview, a warning shot across the bow of every fragile state built on unsustainable models. Venezuela is next. The timeline is just a question of when, not if. North Korea survives only through Chinese life support, and that could end tomorrow. Even seemingly stable autocracies like Egypt or Pakistan are one oil shock, one climate disaster, one economic crisis away from spiraling. The age of resilient nation-states is ending. We're entering the age of fragility. And the world order we've known since 1945, stable borders, recognized governments, functional international relations, is becoming optional. Cuba proved it. When the oil runs out, when the power goes dark, when the state can't deliver the most basic functions, everything else is just theater. The flags still fly, but nobody salutes. The laws still exist, but nobody enforces them. The government still claims authority, but nobody listens. And in that vacuum, humanity does what it's always done. It adapts. It survives. It builds something new from the ruins of something old. Cuba's final collapse wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The beginning of a new Cuba, forged in darkness and desperation. The beginning of a new era where nations rise and fall faster than we ever imagined. The beginning of the question that will define the next century. What comes after the nation-state? Cuba is showing us the answer, and it's more terrifying and more hopeful than anyone expected. The lights went out on February 5th, 2026, but in the darkness, something's being built. We just don't know what yet. And neither do the Cubans. But they're building it anyway, because what other choice is there? When your oil reserves hit zero, when your government collapses, when the world moves on without you, you either die or you evolve. Cuba is evolving, and the world will never be the same.